Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Goddles and Pat Cummings. Recently, my son showed me a Ring camera video from his office warehouse, which is located close to a homeless shelter in West Seattle. He was alerted to motion at the entrance at about midnight and started watching and listening from his home. Two men were smoking fentanyl. Soon one fell to the ground, motionless, overdosing as the other ran away. My son called 911. The man was dying. Soon a police car with officers arrived and administered aid. Then fire department sent two vehicles, and later an ambulance with paramedics transferred the revived man to the hospital. The good news is the man is alive. The bad news is that in 2024, the city of Seattle responded to 3,600 such overdose calls. Most police calls are not related to crime, and most fire department calls are not to put out fires. Our emergency rooms are increasingly psychiatric and drug triage centers. What is going on? Let's discuss. Well, warm greetings. We have a special guest, Michelle Phelps, who is a sociologist in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the Twin Cities. And we are discussing your book, The Minneapolis Reckoning, which is the race, violence, and the politics of policing in America. Michelle, you're a sociologist, and you are a very good researcher, and I think a better writer. This is a well-written book as an overview to policing in Minneapolis with applications for policing all over the United States. How did you come across this topic, and give us some background on how the book came together?
Sure, thank you. It's kind of an unusual book in a lot of ways. So I was just recently tenured when I was in the thick of this research project, and it was really sparked by the 2015 police killing of Jamar Clark in North Minneapolis, and the rise more generally of the BLM movement across the country. And at the time, what I thought I was interested in studying was what I was calling the policing field. So who were the network of activists and organizers, but also bureaucrats, political leaders, reformers, journalists, who were trying to define the public conception of the problems in policing and what their solutions were. And I had wrapped the project actually by 2019, and at that point had not planned to write a book. And I have drafts of these previous papers from the projects where I try to explain and justify to a national audience why we ought to care about Minneapolis. And then, of course, George Floyd was murdered just some blocks from my home in South Minneapolis at the time. And so that really set me off on this, what became the book project, and all of the information I collected in those earlier years in 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019 became preamble for this story I didn't know I was going to tell, both about how we get to the killing itself and the unrest that follows, but also the complicated aftermath of that murder. And because of the massive attention on Minneapolis, and because of the importance of what happens in 2020 in Minneapolis and the years that have followed, it felt really important to write the book for a broader public audience and not just my community of sociologists.
Mm-hmm. And I said it's a well-written book. It has what I like in books. It's academic. It's well footnoted. A lot of research. You can tell you really worked your graduate students pretty hard with getting them out in the community and collaborating with you on this. Um, but it sort of tells the story of policing, not just with the incidents that occurred after George Floyd, but beforehand. Your book was really written saying there's something not quite right here even before that happened, and then that fell in your lap. Um, I remember, what is it, the Kern report back in 1967? You remember that, Greg, when the
Yeah, I
cities.
do. Yeah, yeah. Former governor of Illinois, Kerner. You talking
Oh,
about the Kerner report?
Kerner report, right?
Yeah,
Otto Kerner.
Right. And that's if you look at what their conclusions were, with that, it's that we need to work with the community, we need to look at jobs, we need to look at the situations that are kind of creating these problems that we're having, and that's similar to some of your conclusions too. Um, the let's go to how you went about doing your foundation of the book with interviews of both activists and, more importantly, the people in the community, that people of color, people in the poorer sections of the Twin Cities that are having an impact of the policing that is at times pretty negative experience for them. Tell us, give us some background there.
Sure, yeah. So, the projects that came to form the data and analysis for the book were really a set of discrete projects that were kind of loosely connected together, but became separate chapters. I joke that the chapters feel a little bit like choose your own adventures. This is not a sociological book where each chapter is a sort of new theme on the same set of data, but each chapter is really tracing a different piece of the story. And so, chapter 3 of the book focuses on a set of over 100 interviews that a team of students and I collected in 2017 to 2019. To your earlier point, I mean, I will say for all of us, this was a labor of love and an exhausting project to work on. But it started really, those neighborhood interviews, which we did in North Minneapolis. So North Minneapolis is sort of cultural heart of Black Minneapolis and the site of the most pronounced residential segregation and economic inequality in the city. And it was where Jamar Clark had been shot and killed by police officers. And so it was a natural place to cite our research. And what we wanted to know was there was this big public conversation about police violence and police violence against Black men in particular. How were residents of the community who were most impacted by police violence, how are they making sense of this public conversation? And what did they want to see change in their neighborhoods? And it started not because I had the plan for this project and because I then went out and hired and tasked a bunch of students with carrying it out, but it started because students came to me and came to my office, and many of them had been protesting as part of the BLM movement and wanted to merge what to them felt like these separate spheres of the activism they were doing in their day-to-day lives and the research they were doing in their scholarly lives, and wanted to know, how do we bring these things together and how do we create a better sociology around policing and police violence? And so it was really this team of students that co-designed with me this study. And so in the end, we talked to over 100 residents. Two of my students who conducted the interviews and analyzed the interviews, Amber Joy Powell and Chris Robertson, are actually my co-authors on that chapter. That's the only part of the book that's co-authored, because they put so much of their heart and soul into that analysis, and in part from their own lived experiences. Both grew up in uh, different levels of kind of economic privilege, but Black neighborhoods in different cities, and have experienced the lived experience of police violence. And so what we found in those interviews, and that really shaped the key insights of the book, were that community members felt trapped between police violence on the one hand and community violence on the other. And so what that meant in practice is that residents weren't sure, both in the pre-2020 and post-2020 period, weren't sure who to turn to, and were distrustful of the city's attempts to move away from policing with that 2021 ballot initiative. And it wasn't because they supported the MPD. It wasn't because they supported the police generally. It was because they were rightfully concerned about who else are we going to call. And like it or not, police are the one institution that are required to respond when we call for service, and we have to call a lot, right? Because there are all of these structural forces that are creating violence and insecurity in the neighborhood. And it was those residents who were most able to articulate, this is about anti-Blackness. This is about racism. And racism was ultimately the fundamental cause of a lot of the insecurity they were facing in the neighborhood. And that was ultimately what needed to change, right? So policing gets cast not necessarily as the cause of the inequality, but rather a symptom of that inequality.
And that goes back to the Kerner report. You know, when you have In Minneapolis, as I understand it, you have the North End, which is a small a portion where I don't know how to describe it. Can you use the word term ghetto? I mean, it's where all of the black and poor are are located. It's like the south side of Chicago. It's like certain ports in, Rainier Beach and Seattle. It's a condensed area, and they have problems with crime, poor living conditions, black on black crime. It's not a very nice place to live, and then you have the rest of the city, which is very progressive. Wasn't your book originally going to be policing in the progressive city? And that's the way Seattle is too, which is very liberal, very progressive. So you have these two distinct parts of the city, and in the poorer parts, it's unequal. It's poor living conditions. It's no jobs. It's unemployment. It's a kind of a hot mess. And then you have the police that are supposedly going to try to deal with that, which is not the best response. Isn't that kind of some of your conclusions? I mean, you can't expect the people to wrest their way out of these systemic issues that have been in your community for a long time.
That's right. So, North Side in Minneapolis, I joke sometimes that Minneapolis is a small town masquerading as a city. So the scale here is quite small. You can drive from end to end of Minneapolis in about 15 minutes most days. It's not a large city. It's a mid-sized city. And so there is stark residential segregation, but it is not the hyper concentrated urban poverty that we think of in the mega cities. So there aren't a lot of neighborhoods, for instance, that have massive high rises. This
Mhm.
is the kind of poverty where a lot of folks are living still in single family homes, but those homes are run down and falling apart, and they don't have the money to make the repairs. So, the density of the poverty looks a little bit different, but all of its consequences are the same, right? So the high rates of joblessness among youth and adults, the high rates of exposure to victimization, the high rates of exposure to the criminal justice system. And, residents, it was interesting. You say it's not a very nice place to live, and I hear where you're coming from on that, but there's also this intense pride of
Mhm.
Northsiders, right? Northside
Mhm.
is one of the few places where you
Mhm.
can go, and you can go to, like a Black Arts Museum. You can go to these cultural centers that are really organized around Black life in Minneapolis. And there's pockets of Northside that are actually quite secure, that are just right adjacent to really hard hit neighborhoods. So Northside is a diverse place, and a place that people felt a lot of love and connection to, and a lot of gratitude for living, and also simultaneously felt like they had gotten the short end of the stick. And that's particularly true if you compare it with some of the wealthier neighborhoods in the southwestern corner of the city around the famous chain of lakes, where you get the kinds of neighborhoods where it makes sense that you're seeing Minneapolis ranked on, best cities to live and cities with most amenities. And the scale of wealth and the scale of resources there looks really different. And it looks really different not because they have fewer police roaming the streets, right? They have fewer police roaming the streets because they have all of these resources that create family and community well-being and thriving in ways that preempt the kinds of disorder and victimization that often prompt a law enforcement response. And yes, we've known the answer to this since the Kerner Commission, since the 1960s, and we can go back in time even further. There have been a series of moments of outrage about police violence where the public periodically comes to a little bit more of a conversation about the limits of policing, right? Police can be physically present, and they can deter activity through their presence. They can arrest somebody and take them out, at least temporarily, from the community, and those folks can be incarcerated. That's about it, right? So if we think about all of the kinds of things that have contributed to well-being in our life, very rarely would we say, "Oh, I made that decision," or "this happened in my life because there was this coercive apparatus at the state that was going to punish me or show up if I didn't do that or if I did do it." And so what the Kerner Commission concludes is we need this massive economic reinvestment, that the only answer to the black-white divide in economic opportunity, but also generational wealth, neighborhood stability. The only answer is massive economic redistribution not compensates, that's not the right word, but that recognizes the depth of the harms of slavery and continued forms of racism in this country, and attempts in a real way to ameliorate that historical pattern. And instead, what we got in the late 1960s was a rightward turn where the states and the federal government actually pulled money out of cities, not only not investing in the way the Kerner Commission called for, but de-investing in city centers.
Greg, jump in here. Did you see applications when we were talking about Minneapolis? Do you see applications of what's going on in Pittsburgh with the residents maybe feeling like they're being over policed or inappropriately policed, but also extremely desirous of being protected more and having crime dealt with, but not necessarily through how it's being responded to through only the police intervention? Is that
It's
ring?
everywhere. I mean, of
Huh?
course, it's everywhere. Of course, it's in every urban area. Pittsburgh has it. Pittsburgh's very much like Minneapolis in that it's really linked communities, neighborhoods more than anything. It's more of a small town that grew up and now is shrinking, but it has all the urban problems. What I like about the book so much is, unlike so many academic works or academically directed works, it actually takes a deeper dive and gives us an understandable deeper dive into a hotbed question. You know, the question's been simplified by the media to such a great extent. On one side, you have young, often white, many times white, university style students, younger people who really don't have a great investment in family, home, neighborhood, whatever. And their simple solution is get rid of the police, you know, defund the police, make the police go away. They're just all bad. And that's one extreme, and that's sensationalized by the media. The other extreme is the right wing group that sensationalizes crime. You know, for the last, what, 3, 4 years, crime rate has actually been going down in America. And yet, if you turn your boob tube on, your impression will be that we're at war, you know, that people are killing each other in the streets and so on. And that side sensationalizes the danger, the fears that people have. And the beauty of the book is that it shows that there's a contradiction here. There's a desire on the part of people to be safe. And the proof in that pudding is in the poorer neighborhoods, that desire is there. They don't want to be victimized. I mean, it's silly for young activist types to dismiss that as, you know, irrelevant. On the other hand, the exaggeration, you know, we've got to police, we've got to give them guns. The Biden approach back in his era, and Obama too, he added to this, was to arm these people, make them a military, a quasi military force, and go in and it sends this message that those people are of no value, that, you know, they're disposable. And any of us that may be economically a little better off knows this. In our heart, we know it. If we've been pulled over for erratic driving or whatever, they know how we're treated simply by how we look, if we're white or we have a nice car or whatever, as opposed to someone in a beat up old jalopy and who happens to be black, it's even more dangerous. So this book, I think, great value is showing this contradiction. I don't know that it gives us an answer. I don't know that the Kerner Commission gave us an answer. I don't know if we have an answer. We go back to the Industrial Revolution and we see that, and it wasn't black and white, it was poor and rich, working class and wealthy. We had the same contradictions. The poor laws in England during the Industrial Revolution, it never was resolved. They never figured out how to make the police not be an arm of those well-off people, serve their interest and not serve the interest of poor people. So, you know, I just think the book is something, it's a sober book. It's a book that brings sobriety to a question that's been so sensationalized. I mean, it's hard to even talk to people about this question. Uh, uh, so, so I would just finish by saying, everyone should read this book and leave you with a question, Michelle. And the question is, the answer for so long in my lifetime has been oversight boards, police review boards, create something in an urban area like Pittsburgh or in Minneapolis or wherever, Chicago, where citizens could review the activity of the police and that will solve it all. Obviously, it hasn't worked. Why hasn't it worked?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, and just to back up for a moment on all those thoughts, I do think the book was really hard to write initially. I really had writer's block when I started because of that polarization of the public conversation. I would write a sentence and I would include a word like safety, and I would think, oh, I have to define safety to even say this sentence, and how is this side going to perceive this sentence, and how is this side going to perceive it? And it took me a long time to get past the fear of having tough conversations and not even tough conversations bridging the left-right divide, but really having tough conversations across the left, right? Between people who were very much committed to the project of police abolition and folks who are very much committed to the project of police reform. I don't know how much, somebody who is committed to the story that police can do no wrong and the only thing we need is more law and order and more resources funneled to the police, and the problem is those criminals. Like, if you have a hard right-wing perspective, I'm not sure how much of my book you're going to get through. But I think that there's this huge, vast array of experiences and perceptions among, the left sort of capital, like writ large left, right? So from Democrats to kind of more radical folks. And it was really that conversation that I was trying to bridge. And the answer that I come to, and I agree with you that this is not the answer to end all answers. And the conclusion chapter of my book is quite hesitant about, specific policy prescriptions and why I think those are often misleading at the ends of these kinds of books. But the closest I come to an answer is sort of a framework more than an answer. And that framework is to say, in fact, that straddling of both pragmatist, sort of realist short-term reforms and the radical vision of abolition, straddling that is actually the closest you can get to an answer, right? That we need to think about how do we not just reduce the harms of policing, which is a valuable, if somewhat impossible task, but also how do we shrink their role and how do we make them obsolete, right? How do we make policing obsolete? The abolitionists ask is in fact the right question. And it's interesting because I get many of those young white students who have been politically mobilized by the BLM movement in my class. And they often come to the end of my classes and say to me, well, I was an abolitionist when I started this class, and I'm still an abolitionist, but now I think it's a lot more complicated. And I always think, all right, I think that's the right step, but also don't stop at it's complicated, and so I can't make any moves to make any changes. You need to take that next step of say it's complicated, but there's also work all of us can be doing in our day-to-day lives that can incrementally move us forward, either in the like very macro level policy change and conversation change and material changes, but also in the micro, right? How we interact with one another at a human to human level, how we're connected to our neighbors and the people in our social networks. That matters, and that is a move in the right direction if we can do it with grace and empathy and connect to the people around us. So that's a really big answer of saying, what about civilian review boards, and do those hold any promise? And in Minneapolis, the history of failed civilian review boards is quite long, and goes back to the 1940s. And they have been plagued by a number of issues that I think boil down to the essence of most of these boards have very little power over the police and are very easily co-opted by police interests. And even in the best case of scenarios, they respond at the back end when misconduct has already happened. Now, maybe you think that there's some kind of deterrence here operating, that if officers think that they might be held accountable for misconduct, just like people think that people who commit crimes might be deterred from doing that if the criminal justice system responds to them. Maybe we can think that these civilian review boards could potentially have bigger level effects. But the direct effect is to respond after misconduct has already happened and to sanction it. And the line between what is misconduct and what is legitimate police violence that is in the interest of their day-to-day duties is really murky, right? And police can be, not all officers, but some officers are very savvy at manipulating the evidence to be on the right side of that line of legitimate or illegitimate use of force. So, for instance, brutalizing somebody while obscuring their body camera or making vocal commands like do not resist when the person is not resisting, that then build into that evidentiary base this sort of suspicion that the person was resisting. So I think it's a combination of things. I think they're typically given very little power. I think they're easy for the police to co-opt, and I think it's very difficult to have this hard line between what is police misconduct and what is legitimate police conduct and use of force in the line of duty. And I think they come really late in the process. That all said, I think they are part of this continual pushing the boulder up the hill of how do we do what we can to try to make police misconduct more visible, more well documented, and to reduce its incidence among police officers who are acting today. And the more I think we can put community members in charge and community organizations as part of the process so that it's not just the police investigating the police, I think that is a good idea. I don't think it is going to be a panacea, much like many other reforms that are perennially popular but also continually fail.
I, you know, I kind of disagree a little bit. I think that of course there's problems with the police, and there's problems with the police having, huge number of vets that come into the police and have kind of a military approach. A lot of them have maybe some problems with that. Um, Recruiting good people and retaining them. A lot of the good, just like teachers, some of the good teachers leave because they're frustrated with it. But they're doing what they're being told to do. They're what their commands are being told to do. I started this podcast with a short description of something that happened 2 days ago, where my son was showing me a ring video of his office in an area of West Seattle where he was awake at midnight, and two people were smoking fentanyl, and all of a sudden one guy just falls over and is just gone. And my son called 911 and said, there's someone dying in front of my shop here in West Seattle. Two policemen came immediately, ended up getting him Narcan to bring him back. Fire department came. It couldn't have been a better response. The ambulance came. The fellow that was smoking fentanyl with him came back with someone from the homeless shelter to try to help him. It wasn't he left to get help. And I'm thinking, this is what happens all the time in Seattle. 3,600 overdose calls in Seattle. And it's the police that are the primary ones interfacing with these things. And when we are talking about defunding the police, everyone says, "Oh, to me, I'm wondering, is this call probably cost $10,000 to the taxpayers?" And in the voice on this video, they said this is the second time this guy overdosed that day. He's already was into the hospital once that day. So that gets to, simply who responds to these events is part of the issue. The police are inordinately being asked to respond to these psychiatric issues, these drug issues, these complaints, and they're doing what they're being told. But then that puts them in the forefront of all of the conflicts related to the problem. Why is this guy on drugs? Why is this guy homeless? What are they doing? So it's that's a pretty convoluted discussion. But I'm thinking, in your book, you said that only a small percentage of police calls are related to violence. You know, they're domestic, they're traffic, they're resolving conflicts. And when you're looking at defunding the police, it doesn't mean that you need less police. It means that you need to orient your r- social responses more effectively than having an officer be the primary one dealing with this. Do you agree with that? Am I rambling a little bit, or what do you feel?
Well, I was tracing the journey there because you started with, I disagree with you. And I thought, okay, where do we disagree? And then you continued to go, and I agree with that. I agree with that. I agree with that.
Well, I mean, it's like the
But
police.
I
You
think I
you
got
have
there.
you have police violence. Don't get me wrong. You have police violence during the George Floyd in Seattle. We had a huge crowd, and the federal government came in and looked at it and said the police response was horrible. They used pepper spray, they used rubber bullets, they used blast caps. Said the person investigating it said he had never seen such an inappropriate overuse of violence in responding to 3,000 people that were essentially all peaceful, but a couple of anarchists from Oregon. The police were just someone told them to do all of those things. So, someone told them to use blast caps. It wasn't like there's something innate within the psychology of these police officers. They were doing exactly what they were told, when they were told, how they were told. And a lot of this was being dictated by councilmen and mayors and but by people beyond them. So I get there's bad policemen, but
Well, Ted,
primarily there's
let
good policemen being put into bad positions. Greg, you're
me
going to yell
let
at
me
me. What do you
jump in.
think?
Yeah, because yeah, I mean, look, when you look at it more deeply, like the book suggests you look at it more deeply, the idea of defunding the police is not the radical idea. It's not the most radical left-wing idea that young people like to make it out. The more radical idea is the Kerner Commission. That's a radical idea. They don't even talk about the police. They talk about the economic conditions, the socioeconomic conditions that create the poverty, that creates the constant violence that occurs in American society. And the police respond to that. So you don't have to talk about the police. You don't have to demonize the police. I mean, I agree. People to take that job on idealistically, they're out there. There are many of them that really believe in what they're doing, but they're not really the problem. In fact, we've reached a point in our society in which we think we accept the fact that we have social economic inequality. And then we go say, well, it's the police that are the problem. No, it's poverty that's a problem. That's the problem. And the police are in the they're in the midst of this contradiction, and we don't want to address it. We don't want to face the fact that poverty, whether it's in industrial era England, or whether it's in Germany, whether it's in the East, wherever it is, it's poverty. And we don't want to face the fact that other countries have lower rates of violence in their societies. We don't want to make the comparison between our social inequality and, say, the social inequality in Germany or in France or in China. Go around the world, there's almost a direct relationship between violence and the socioeconomic level of development. Because if we looked at that, we'd have to say the changes are fundamental that have to be done, not just defunding the police or civilian review boards or what have you. Those are the real answers to this problem.
You said it, you stated it, I think, better than I did, Greg. That's kind of what I was trying to get at. I don't know.
And I'm
Michelle, your
actually,
thoughts. You're the
You're the
expert here.
expert. We're the windbag.
We are just done. We are Dunner Kruger stunches. We just think we know more than we do,
Yeah,
but we
hey,
really don't
bring
know.
a little reasonableness into this whole thing.
it's your podcast.
I know, but we're
You
not
know,
as smart as we think we are. So anyway, you are, Ed, but you are.
I think this is actually an idea that I have often thought in the back of my head. hey, here's a place where actually cops and leftists can be in conversation together. If we could just come up with the way to talk about it that could bridge across those constituencies, because the police recognize that they don't have all the answers to these crises either. If you talk to any police chief across the country and you say, do you want to be responding? Do you want your officers responding to all of the consequences of urban inequality or rural inequality and rural poverty? Do you want your police officers responding to overdoses? Are your staff well equipped to respond to mental health crises? Are they well equipped to respond to people who are unhoused and actively using, right? Most officers and leaders of law enforcement will say, absolutely not. Most of the calls that we get, most of the things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis are what officers will call bullshit calls, right? They're not the real work of fighting crime or the real work of responding to violence. And so I think that prompts the question then, well, if cops don't want to show up to those calls, and if police always carry this risk of lethal intervention, right? So in the case that you mentioned, Pat, it sounds like things were resolved as well as could be resolved given the level of really horrific crisis that was there. I mean, two overdoses in one day. Um, but there are certainly other cases where police have been called in, say, because somebody is acting erratically because they are having an overdose or because they're in a mental health crisis, where law enforcement have then killed those individuals, right? Because they weren't responding to commands, and officers interpreted that in a way that escalated the violence. And so it doesn't always end well when law enforcement respond, and they're not terribly well equipped to respond to those kind of crises. So while I agree with you, Greg, that the answer is the inequality, the answer is the poverty, I think we can also, in the more short term, be much more creative about who we send in to respond to those kinds of 911 calls, right? So yes, they need a response, and yes, people deserve a response, but does it have to be law enforcement? And as you both know, in the final empirical chapter of the book, I look at a couple of alternative public safety models that have developed in Minneapolis. And most relevant to this conversation is the behavioral crisis response, which sends in unarmed mental health professionals to respond to behavioral and mental health crisis. So we can think about lots of other kinds of response models that don't involve sending in armed police officers who are trained primarily in criminal law, how to arrest people, and use of force and defensive driving and all of the above, but people who are trained and have a professional mindset that looks really different.
Well, that's
And that's
investing in people. I mean, that's what that is related to socioeconomic inequality, because it's an investment in the people in communities. It's not writing them off as violent and, there are no counts. It's investing in the people, and I agree with that. But I don't. We have still a lot of time, but I don't want to get away from the question of the consent decree, only because I saw it come up last week that it actually was granted, and I said, "Wow, we've got Michelle Phillips. She
Phelps.
can comment on this. This is like a coup. Our podcast is going to have her on in the aftermath of it. Could you comment on it? Take us through that whole process and what it means, and if it doesn't mean all that."
Sure. Yeah. Um, so Minneapolis is set to be the first city that is under both a state and a federal consent decree to reform its policing practices. So to take you back, George Floyd was murdered in May 2020, as you know, because Donald Trump's DOJ was not interested in these kinds of pattern and practice investigations into police departments, and in fact had worked quite hard to wind down the existing consent decrees. The state intervened. So it was the Minnesota Department of Human Rights opened an investigation into the police department, which was quite unusual, but was in part a feeling that the feds weren't going to come. And so that investigation process begins. Biden is elected. We have the Biden inauguration. And that then leads to the DOJ opening an investigation into the MPD. And so now we have these parallel investigations. We eventually have parallel reports. And this is the final step in the process, which is parallel consent decrees. And that There is now an agreement between the city and the DOJ, at least initially, and it is being worked out in court with the lawyers, I think, on both sides trying to get this agreement in place before we again reach a Trump inauguration. The actual content of the consent decree, I think in many ways was pretty expected. It does what a lot of consent decrees over police departments have done in recent years. So it mandates reforms to department policies, it mandates reforms to the misconduct review process. And I think most important of all is that the consent decrees require that there is an external monitor, a court monitor that is tasked with seeing what is actually being implemented on the ground. Because the Minneapolis Police Department, like many other police departments, has promised to make very similar reforms to everything that is in both of those consent decrees over the years. The problem has been the follow through and the details and what does it actually look like on the ground. And what a consent decree allows us to do is to have this external monitor. Now, that external monitor is typically, and in this case, people and organizations with a lot of law enforcement expertise. So we shouldn't look to the consent decree and say, this is going to lead to radical changes. It's going to dismantle policing or turn it into a different kind of institution. But what it can do is bring departments' policies and practices into alignment with what we now understand to be the best practices around things like use of force and misconduct review policies. And excitingly, the DOJ report and the consent decree also include some provisions about people with mental illness in particular, and trying to make sure that the city continues to expand and provide these alternative emergency responses for behavioral crisis, which was a new thing in the Minneapolis report and something I am excited to see whether they continue that work in future iterations of these DOJ investigations, assuming we have any more in the future, depending on the politics there.
And that's what I liked about your book is that it's just not more policing, more arresting. It's how the police are deployed. It's not it's how they interact with the community. It's the I think if I got one thing from your book, it's you have the community and you have the police, and if they are not operating under in together, um, then you're not going to deal with this problem. The police can't arrest their way out of this problem, and there's a lot of things that police can do that in their relationship with the community that will be positive for everybody. I, for example, having community intervention, or what do they call it, where you have the community-oriented policing, where when there's violence, you'll bring in other people to try to de-escalate the violence and so forth, in conjunction with the police.
Mhm.
Um, I have more police in my family than you just can't believe how many police I have in my family. I have four sisters. One's a police chief, retired. The other's a social worker, just like you, sociologist, MSW, and she is married to the assistant police chief of Seattle, who was retired. Another who lives in a rural area, whose son's a correction officer. And there's a whole set of new issues with poor poverty rural areas. Another sister has a son that's a sergeant in a detective in southern part of the state, and another one has daughters married to a Seattle police officer, a young guy. And when we get together at our family meetings and chat, of course, they think that I'm kind of totally wrong on a lot of this stuff, and I probably am. But the stories they tell of the compassion and bringing people in and buying them sandwiches and things like this that just never get shown, how they work within the community to try to build the trust and slowly build the trust. That's the police that I see. I don't see the police knocking people around. I see people doing impossible jobs with communities that are not very functional at all. Homelessness, fentanyl, meth, violence. So I don't know. There you
Well,
go.
and
That's
I think
that's my confession. So,
Well, and I think it's important because I think that's part of why our politics around policing get so stuck is
uh-huh.
because who people see when they imagine police, right? Who's in
Right.
their imagination because of what they've experienced is so wildly divergent, you know? And one of the quotes that really haunted me from the interviews with folks in North Minneapolis was a woman who said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but something like, you know, you see them on National Night Out. You see them at these events where they're trying to give kids bikes, and it's almost like an apology, like, sorry, hey, don't get mad at us when we shoot your kid later, right? And
Mhm.
so I think for law enforcement, those kinds of positive moments with the community, whether it be reaching out or whether it be, you know, on the day-to-day responding to calls, that is what looms large for them because that is the sort of vast majority of their experiences and the piece of the job that they linger on. But for community members, it's not necessarily that all of their experiences are negative or that all of their experiences are violent. It's that that threat of violence is
Mhm.
always there because they have in the back of their mind the last video they watched, the story of their family member, their friend who got, you know, brutalized or killed, the town they're in, the high profile case they know from that town, right? And so every interaction, you could have an interaction that is perfectly legitimate, perfectly procedurally just. The officer does everything right. They walk away from the experience going, that was policing done right. I'm an upstanding officer. This was a great experience. You know, green check marks all along. And the
Mhm.
person who experienced it lived such a different reality in their mind because every moment they were hyper vigilant. What if this turns south? What if I'm in danger? What if my family is in danger? And so, to have the conversation, I think, about policing, we have to take seriously both what it often looks like in practice, but also what people are imagining, and not because they're creating these imaginary worlds, what people are worried about because the very real threat that it could turn out that way, even when it doesn't, right? And so that is never far from many Black Americans' minds when they interact with law enforcement. And it's part of, I think, the victory of the BLM movement is that that has come at least more into public conversation, even if the country doesn't have a good answer of what to do with that information and that conversation.
Yeah.
You
Go ahead,
know,
Greg.
it's yeah, it's hard to escape people viewing anything in their lives except on a personal basis. Whether you confront when you see a cop, the cop's rude to you, or whether you see a cop and the cop says, "Oh, I know how to get there," until he gives you directions. Everybody has their own personal experiences, but the key to any of our social problems is people taking a broader picture of things. And I would suggest for you know your family members my view is the police are stuck in the middle of this contradiction that we've talked about now for 40 minutes, 45 minutes. And, you know, I feel that they must feel they can't win in that situation. But if you take a longer and a broader view of it, you go back to the Clinton administration, there was an opportunity to put the money into the kind of things that Michelle envisions. That is, more of a sympathetic, more people in the communities that can help people with the basic problems that annoy the police they have to deal with. The choice was taken differently in that administration. Biden played a big role in that as a senator. That was to militarize the police. And you're you know you have a family of police people, maybe 20, 30 years. They remember the better times, but that was a change in urban policing,
Hmm.
dramatic change by militarizing them. You know, when you see, I remember the G20 was in Pittsburgh. It was an armed camp, and it was all police from Chicago, from Cleveland, from all major urban areas. They were dying to get in here, dying to be here. I'm sure the ordinary policeman didn't want to participate, want to stay home and watch the football game. But there's a class of people in the police community that are armed, SWAT teams, et cetera, are just looking for a fight. We'll have an incident in Pittsburgh where someone barricades themselves, and there must be SWAT teams from every neighborhood dying to get here with their guns out. And that mentality is part of what's been created by this militarization of the police. And people they have to
But
understand that's
the
bad.
police didn't create that. The politicians created that.
I understand that. That's
You
my
know,
point. My point is the
right,
police are caught in the midst of a
right,
contradiction. But they
right.
must understand they're caught in it. They can't idealize. When I grew up in small town America, the police were my friends. I mean, I knew them personally. They were people I went to school with. Sometimes they'd be rude to me and I'd just be rude back to them and it'd go away. That's not what you get in urban areas. In Pittsburgh, they changed the law. You used to have to be a resident of the city of Pittsburgh to be a cop. They fought like hell to eliminate that. Why would they fight that? Why would they insist that they be allowed to live outside of the city and then still be cops in this area? Because it allowed the worst cops to be on the police force. So, I mean, these contradictions are contradictions, and all sides have to understand that and appreciate it.
Yeah, Michelle, do you get called in to do workshops with police and politicians and community? I mean, it just seems like this conversation needs to be had with a whole group of people. You know, do you do that at all, or do you just do the research that sees what happens after the fact with this?
No, where I get called in the most is usually sort of community-driven reform conversation. So people who
Hmm.
are trying to get together to say, how can we push for change and what does it look like? Or, when the DOJ came in, sort of expert testimony about the MPD and its history. The MPD does not call me. The new chief did follow me on Twitter a while back, and I thought,
Uh-huh. Hmm.
wonder if the book has made it, or like a one-page synopsis of the book has made it to that office. I think in Minneapolis, because of the public scrutiny after George Floyd's killing, there are so many consultants and experts and researchers. The city's in the midst of 3 or 4 different evaluation and technical assistant processes around reimagining public safety and redesigning public safety initiatives. So my sense is that the city is sort of tapped out on consultants, but also that folks are deploying that research expertise strategically, right? And calling on experts they think are going to give them the kind of answer that is most in alignment with their political vision. And sociology is an awkward one. I mean, one of the big conclusions of the book in the final chapter is that cities can't solve the scale of inequality and poverty on their own, that it actually takes state and federal resources. And so what do you do with that if you're a city leader, right?
Right.
Besides advocate for better policies at the state level or energize folks to vote in presidential elections, right? But they're just like the hands of law enforcement are tied and they control very few pieces of the puzzle. So do local city leaders actually are in a similar bind, although it plays out differently.
Right. Well, as much as I had some problems with part of the BLM movement, it did have some positive effects. I mean, people are now talking about de-escalation training and mental health support and, using body cams and oversight, the accountability oversight mechanisms and police agree with all of those. I mean, I don't think they have a problem with those. So, I mean, there have been some positive initiatives that have come out of this, and now you're talking about relocating, reallocating the resources. There was an article in The Intercept in January 8th. The headline: "L.A. budgeted more money for cops while cutting funds for the fire department, and now the city's burning." They and that goes to your opinion, your issue too, Greg, of this just huge police is spending and force. We're going to police our way out of this, and then cutting fire. These are community decisions that need to be made well with a lot of input, and your input's good. So I'm electing you as a city council person. You should have an honorary position there that just periodically, stops everything and say, no, you're wrong about that, and cite the research. You would have a better city with that, with you on the council, Michelle.
We'll see.
Oh,
I will say on the kind of fact checking, I think Police support some of the reform initiatives that have rolled out, but they have fought tooth and nail against a lot of the tightening misconduct review processes. I think
Yeah, right.
police officers and their unions are very resistant to being
That's
held
true.
accountable. And for precisely that reason that I talked about when we were talking about civilian oversight, that the line between legitimate and illegitimate violence is very murky in police. So we do ask them to use violence in their jobs. And I think police officers want as much discretion to use that violence. If we're going to task them with violence, they want to be responsible for how it's deployed and not worry about accountability and not worry about, potential legal repercussions. And I think that creates real challenges in trying then to respond effectively to when officers do cross that line and figure out who should be responsible for arbitrating where that line is between legitimate and illegitimate uses of force.
Right. Qualified immunity is a mess that needs to be dealt with. There's a lot of things that could be improved, but it's those are policy decisions, and I don't think the politicians have the gumption to really tackle this as effectively as they should. I know in Seattle they've screwed it up so many times with the CHOP and how they've responded to all of the issues. Now they're having a problem of responding to the fact that they're not arresting people for having their tabs expired. So we have huge shortfalls in our city. Can't fund the ferries because nobody's getting their tabs expired because the police are told don't pull people over for those types of events. So, sometimes that's not a police problem, that's a policy problem that the police are implementing, and the unintended consequences that sometimes occur from that are significant. So, anyway, you're wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for chatting with us and putting up with a couple of fellows that
Ranting old timers.
just crazy old loons. And here, I guarantee you, the copies of your books are going to my family members. We're going to have great Thanksgiving conversations, and I really think you nailed it. And it's the best overview I've seen of dealing with this issue. And I hope you have good luck with it. What's any new
Thank
books
you.
coming?
Not yet. I'm kicking around some work with extending the work with the alternative public safety models and kind of what that looks like moving
Mm,
forward. I think that is one of the unsung victories of
right,
summer 2020 and one of the few places we see radical changes being pushed forward, even if in really incremental day-to-day ways, or because of their
right,
incremental
right.
day-to-dayness. Um, and I'm really excited to see what researchers and academics and sociologists can do to help push that conversation, because that to me feels like part of the answer of how we get past this continual, we need the cops, but they commit violence, right? Part of the answer there is how do we shrink their scale, not by abandoning communities to deal with the problems on their own, but by developing better responses to the problems communities are facing. And that ultimately, I don't think police support downsizing themselves. Most institutions wouldn't support. I'm not a fan when people, talk about downsizing higher
Mhm,
education, for
mhm,
instance.
mhm.
But I do think police would be able to do a better job at doing what it is their core mission is, if they weren't tasked with things that are not squarely in their training and purview.
Right. Structuring that is important. Absolutely agree with that. Thank you. Thank you so much. Is it
Thank
cold
you
where
for
you
having
are?
me.
It's a 4 degrees last night I saw when I was.
So cold. Yes, I took my kids to the bus stop this morning and the feel like temperature was negative 30. And my
Oh,
9-year-old was like, it's not even cold. And I was like,
oh
I'm from
God.
Southern California. This is way too cold.
At least your city's not on fire, so that's good. So
That's true. Yeah.
thank
That's a
you.
plus.
Appreciate it, really.
Thank you. Thanks, Michelle.
Yeah, thank you for having me.